everyone, Elsie Jensen here. Today we are going to whip up some pumpkin scones. We're going to make a roast beef sandwich with our leftover focaccia, and then we are going to prep up some we're going to prep up some stuff for dinner tonight. We're going to prep up some sourdough rolls as well as a chicken roast. That way we can kind of pop it in the oven and then we'll finish it off later tonight. But let's start for our, before we jump into our pumpkin scones, we are going to start blooming our yeast for our sourdough rolls. Now, our rolls have about a half a teaspoon of yeast in it. So all of the work is mainly done from the sourdough starter, because we'll be using active starter in it. But it gets a little bit of help from the yeast, which just makes it a much fluffier and a nicer thing. So we're going to start out with 3/4 of a cup of warm milk. You don't want it too hot because you don't want to burn the yeast or like scald it, but nice kind of warm milk. And then we're going to add in a 1/4 cup of sugar. And this is going to be for our dinner rolls tonight. So we've got our warm milk and we're going to add in a 1/4 cup of sugar. And then a half a teaspoon of yeast. And we're just going to let that bloom here for a little bit. And then we'll make our scones and then we'll come back to it and finish up our sourdough roll part for it. But we want to get it going. So a half a teaspoon of yeast. And we're just going to sprinkle it over the top of our warm milk. There we go. And this should get it nice and active and happy. Okay, we're going to set this to the side and then we're going to work on the base for our sourdough pumpkin scones. And we're going to do a brown sugar glaze on them as well. So we're going to start out with our flour and our sugar base for this. And then we'll cut our butter into it. So we're going to use our all-purpose flour. Move this right over here. And we're going to start out with about 2.5 cups of flour. So we need a little bit more because we are using pumpkin and it's a little bit moist, more moist than some of our other mix-ins with scones. So we need a little bit more flour. So 2.5 cups of flour. And let's get our half going. So we've got 2.5 cups of flour, and then we're going to add in a half a cup of brown sugar. The brown sugar is going to be really delicious with the pumpkin scones. It has that nice molasses note to it, which I just think really brings out that flavor and is wonderful. And then we're also going to be doing kind of a brown sugar glaze as well. So a half a cup of brown sugar. Make sure you've got it firmly packed in. And get a little bit of that sugar off of me. And then we're going to add in a teaspoon of salt and then 2.5 teaspoons of baking powder and some spices. And we'll get that kind of going to where we can cut our butter into it. So a teaspoon of salt, 2.5 teaspoons of baking powder, so 1, 2, and a half. And then we're going to do a teaspoon of cinnamon and 2 teaspoons of pumpkin pie spice. And then we're going to give this a quick stir, and then we'll cut in our half cup of butter. So 1 teaspoon of cinnamon and 2 teaspoons of pumpkin pie spice. So 1 and 2. So we've got our kind of our dry base for our ingredients in here. I'm going to take my pastry cutter, which we'll be using to cut our butter into it. And I'm just going to mix all of these dry ingredients together. And this is going to form the base of our nice crumb for our scone. And we'll cut our butter into it just like you would with a pie crust. Okay, making sure I've got it all mixed up well. Here we go. Perfect. So you want 1 stick or a half a cup of cold butter. So I just took it out of the fridge. Nice cold butter is going to give you the best flaky layers for our delicious scones here. Okay. So we're going to kind of cut through it, and then I'm going to cube it, and then we'll cut it into our flour here. And the reason why I like to kind of cut it down the middle and through is because I like it to makes it a little bit easier the cutting in process. Now you could always use a food processor for this if you wanted to, but I find the good old pastry cutters work really well for this. There we go. And then just going to grab a little bit of this butter that's stuck on here. Okay. And I'm going to kind of toss my little chunks of butter here, and we're going to cut it in. And essentially, we want to make sure we got our butter cut in to where we have no pieces bigger than a pea. That way, you don't get any butter pockets in our scone, which happens when like you get a big chunk of butter and then when it melts, it kind of leaves the void. Here we go. Now you could always, again, use a food processor to cut your butter into it, or you could use 2 knives and do the old-fashioned kind of cutting it way, or go even lower tech, you can actually take it and you kind of push it through your fingers like that to kind of mix the butter in. So lots of various ways to do it to get with the same result. Let me grab my butter knife over here. And I always like to go partially through, and then you get a little bit of butter that sticks between your blades here. So just give it a nice kind of whip through your butter knife through, pick it out so you can cut that back in there. Here we go. Perfect. And get back in here. It doesn't take too long to cut this butter in. That's why I always just opt to do it by hand. Now, if I ever have to make a really big batch of scones or whatnot, then yes, I'll use a food processor because it really cuts down on the time. But you got to lug it out and then you got to clean it. So for just a small batch, it's not worth it to drag it out. Here we go. Looks like we've got them all kind of cut up now. And then I'm gonna grab a small bowl and we will do our kind of our wet base, and then we'll mix them together and we'll do our press and folds to make the base of our scones. So let me grab a small bowl here. And for our base for our pumpkin scones, we're gonna use a half a cup of pumpkin puree. I bought a big tub of our box of pumpkin puree from Costco. So I'm like, gotta use it up. Lots of pumpkin inspiration. Okay, so we're gonna use a half cup of our pumpkin puree. So I'm just gonna kind of eyeball what I think is pretty close to about a half cup. Here we go. That should be, we'll do a little teeny bit more. So our half cup of our pumpkin puree. And then we are going to add in 1 egg.
Can you go over what a scone is?
A scone is, the best way I like to describe it, is a mixture between a biscuit and a cookie. So it is sweet like a cookie in the sense, but not as sweet as a cookie. But it has nice flaky layers like a biscuit, but it has kind of a nice crunchy outer crust, but that soft flaky layer in the middle. They're really lovely. And my kids, everyone loves them. They're so delicious because they're not like you can eat them and you don't feel necessarily guilty about it. Okay, we have our egg in here. We've got our pumpkin puree. We're going to add in a half a cup of sourdough discard. So I've got some discard in here because I fed up my starter this morning. So I want to make sure that I save some to the side to use in here. Okay. So we got a half a cup of our discard. Here we go. And then we're going to add in 1/4 cup of cream. Let's see if I can see it on here. There we go. So 1/4 cup of heavy cream. I'm going to mix this in here, and then we're going to add in some vanilla extract. And this is going to be the wet base for our scones. And then we'll work on mixing them together very gently and then doing our press and folds. Okay. And then we have our vanilla extract, and we're going to use a whole teaspoon of vanilla extract. There we go. And now I'm going to mix my ingredients together here. And mixing them here is going to allow you to prevent from over mixing when we combine the two. If you try to throw everything together, what will happen is you'll get just a really stiff lump of a scone that won't have lovely flaky layers. Here we go. So we're adding in our pumpkin and our mixture in here. And then we're going to combine it together for our pumpkin scones. And we're going to make a lovely glaze to go over it. I think I'm going to do a brown sugar and cinnamon glaze. But just make sure, I spread over it, but I'm trying to get this egg whipped up in here. So just make sure you whip your egg in here. This little bit of my egg just does not want to incorporate well. Let me grab a fork here. Sometimes. That's why I also say it's easier to do it in a bowl. There we go. Than it is to try to mix it in there without over mixing it. Okay. Looks like we've got this down. Let me wash my hands. Rinse a little bit of that off. We're going to be using my hands anyways to mix it in here. I'm going to grab out my baking sheet here, and we're going to put some parchment paper on here, because then we're going to press and fold our scone together. But I want to have everything ready so I don't have to wash my hands in between these steps. So nice little bit of parchment paper down. This is going to allow it to bake up nicely and remove off really easily. Okay. We're going to add our wet liquid or mixture into our dry mixture. Here we go. Just try to get up as much of it out as possible. And then I'm going to gently use my fork to toss these together. What you're going to end up with is a dry shag. And then what we'll do is we are going to press and fold the mixture together to make our scone. So just use your fork, and we're going to just toss it until we have all the main wet parts kind of covered. But you don't want to mix this together too much, because we're going to do our press and folds to get the form. So here's our dry shag. I'm going to kind of squeeze this off my fork. And then I'm going to dump this out onto our countertop. And don't worry, it's going to come and make a nice shape together. You want it to look like what I like to say, a nice dry shag for this. And what we're going to do is you're going to press, and then you're going to fold the ingredients up over it. Every one of these folds on here is going to make our layers in our scone. There we go. And as we work it together, these are going to they're going to form together to make a puck, and they're going to make lovely layers that will pop up when we bake. Here we go. And this is our pumpkin scone. I do have this recipe card for our members. I think I sent it out like in September or whatnot. It's been about a month since I made these, but my kids have been kind of on a pumpkin kick this week. So we had to make them again. But I do have the video also for everybody. You can always recreate, but for our members, we do have this recipe card available. Okay, as you can see, we've got our base formed here. So I'm going to kind of divide it into two kind of equal things, and then we'll shape up our pucks. There we go. Maybe add a little bit more to this side. So I'm going to just press and fold into around about a disc type shape. I call them kind of like a puck because they look kind of like a giant hockey puck. We want them to be about an inch to inch and a half thick for it, because then we're going to cut these down into little pieces. I'm going to move this over, transfer our first one, and then we'll mold and shape up our second one. If you wanted to add in, like I would say, you could do chocolate chips, white chocolate chips, pumpkin seeds, craisins, raisins. If you wanted to add something in, you would just do it during that dry shag phase, and then you'd press and fold them in. Here we go. So I'm forming our little puck. We'll scoop this guy up here. And then let me just grab some of these crumbs to the side as we move this down here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to cut each one of these into 8 equal sections. We'll slightly pull them out, and then we'll brush them with a little bit of cream and sprinkle them with a little bit of sugar. So I start by cutting them into fourths, and then I'll cut it through using my pastry cutter. You can also use a butter knife for this as well. Once you've got your 8 kind of pieces cut, you're going to pull them out. And this is going to make, 8 mini scones. Now you can do one big giant puck and cut them into 8 pieces and make 8 bigger scones. I feel that the mini scones bake up a little bit nicer than the big ones. They don't dry out as much because you don't have to cook them as long. And, it's nice. You can eat 2 of the smaller ones and just feel a little bit better. Or 3. My husband loves these. Actually, everybody really loves these scones. They're ones that disappear so fast. Okay, we've got our things. We're just going to pull them out so that they are going to puff up and get bigger. So you want to leave a little gap between them so that they kind of crisp up on those edges as well. I'm going to wash my hands, and then we'll brush them with some cream and pop them in the oven. There we go. Okay. So let me grab a small bowl. We need about a tablespoon of cream. You don't need a whole lot, just a little bit to brush over the top of each one. If you want a shinier coating, you can definitely do an egg wash, but I always feel like it's such a waste of an egg. And the cream, gives you the perfect amount, a nice kind of golden brown, and it's going to allow that sugar to stick onto it.
You have a question? Have you ever made a bacon cheddar onion scone or other savory scones?
I have made savory scones before. I just haven't done them in a long time. I do love a good savory scone, in the sense, it reminds me more of like almost like a specialty biscuit, which I do a lot of savory biscuits. And I keep saying, I'm like, I probably do, and I haven't done one in a while. Maybe I'll do that for a breakfast time one time. Because a nice savory scone is delicious. You omit the sugar and you go with, you've got, bacon or ham, green onions. You can do a lot of different things to kind of play it up. So I'll definitely have to do that. I haven't done it in a while. For me, growing up, I went to this kind of daycare center when I was a kid, and we used to do these elaborate tea parties every year. We'd dress up in our parents' clothes. You had to dress up to the nines. And we would spend like the week before this little tea party baking all sorts of goodies, picking out the teas that we were going to have, like a real true tea party. And that was when I first made scones. And I always did them sweet. And that's just kind of in my mind, they've always been a sweet scone. Let's sprinkle these with a little bit of sugar, and we will pop them in the oven at 400, and these are going to bake for about 18 minutes. Now I'm just going to use a little bit of granulated sugar, but you could use cinnamon sugar, brown sugar on there, but just enough to give it a sweet little crunch. These only have about a half a cup of sugar in them, so they're not as sweet as like a cookie or a muffin or whatnot. They're a lot less sweet, but adding the little sugar on the top, and then of course the glaze that we make just really adds a lovely pop of sweetness on them. Just brings them right over the edge. You only need like a teaspoon or so of the sugar. It's not much. Okay, let's go pop these in the oven. These are going to bake at 400 degrees for about 18. These are 18, yeah, 18 minutes. I have a couple that take a little bit longer, but these are 18 minutes. Here we go. Pop them in there. Make sure your oven is preheated. I'm going to set my timer for 18 minutes. And those should be ready. Let's get our sourdough rolls prepped up because we have our yeast foamy now from getting it ready. So we started off with 3/4 of a cup of warm milk. We added 1/4 a cup of sugar, and we added a 1/2 teaspoon of milk in here, or 1/2 teaspoon of, not milk, of yeast in here. We let it foam up just a little bit. Let me get my active starter, which both of these are, you can see how active they are because they are bursting out, which means I'm going to have to change out their covers. But look at that. I fed that this morning and it was halfway and it has shot up. So for this recipe, we're going to use 1/3 cup of our starter. So let me grab a measuring cup here. Here's 1/3 cup. So you use 1/2 teaspoon of yeast with 1/3 cup of active starter, which means you fed it in the last, 4 to 8 hours. This guy, let me poke him down first. When you poke it down, it pops all those bubbles and it kind of shrinks in size. So, and that's just from the natural gases of it, during that fermentation process as it kind of eats up the sugars in the flour. So we need 1/3 cup of our active starter here. Here we go. We're going to add this into our mixture. And these make the best sourdough rolls that don't need to wait forever to make. A lot of times my sourdough bread, we're going to prep up some of that, but that takes like, a whole day before you can enjoy it. These, you need just a minimum of 5 to 6 hours for them to do their like rising and whatnot, or their leavening part. And they're just fabulous. So let's mix these in. Then we're going to add in 1 egg. So between the yeast, the active sourdough starter, and the egg, that's what's going to really give these a nice fluffy texture to them and very soft. And then we're going to add in 1.5 teaspoons of salt. I'm just going to use my 1/2 teaspoon. We'll do it 3 times. So 1, 2, 3. We're going to mix these in, and then we'll add in our flour. There we go. You just want to make sure you've got that egg yolk and all that egg incorporated into the milk and the starter. There we go. And these have we used 1/4 a cup of sugar in it, but they're not a super sweet one. We're going to add in our flour. We are going to add in 3 cups of our flour. And just all purpose. You can use bread flour, but you don't need to.
You have a question? Is the recipe posted anywhere for these?
This one, I'm not sure if I've ever posted this recipe. So I have another yeast recipe, but it's different from this one, which is it's a sourdough discard with yeast. So it's different. This is more of a sourdough with a little pinch of yeast. These are my favorite, but they take about 5 to 6 hours. So I will upload this video onto our page. We upload all of our lives there. So you can always watch and recreate it. But I might make this a recipe card because this is one of my favorite rolls. Okay, we're going to add in our flour. We need 3 cups of flour. There we go. 2 and 3. And this dough is not going to be as sticky as a traditional sourdough discard dough, or a sourdough, not discard, but a sourdough bread, which is a very high hydration dough. This one, you're going to be able to knead it and work with it, which is nice. So we're going to mix it together until we've got a nice kind of shag form. And then we'll knead it into a ball. And then you just let it sit in a nice, warm spot for about 3 to 4, like 3 or so hours. After about an hour, you will do a quick knead on it, but then you just let it sit there. And then about an hour to an hour and a half before you bake it, I divide this up into 12 to 15 rolls. I think I'll do 12 today. And then you let it sit and kind of rise for an hour.
You have a question. What does discard yeast mean?
So discard is your sourdough starter, which is fermented flour that you use to make sourdough bread. And then yeast is just, the yeast that you add to make a yeast type bread. So this has got a kind of a hybrid of both. Okay, let me grab a quick paper towel here, just so we don't get any of our pumpkin scone tidbits in here. Not that it will ruin it. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to flip this guy out onto the counter. And again, this is kind of like a dry shag too, but it's going to form together to form a nice dough for our rolls. And as this flour hydrates, which is why you're going to do a set of kneading in an hour, it becomes softer and more malleable to work with. Here we go. So we're going to knead it together. So you see, it's not like a sticky loaf of bread like sourdough, which has a much higher liquid content in it. This one, it's a softer, easier to work with. Here we go. Beautiful. Yep, get that piece on there. And then I'm going to pull all these little scraps in and we'll knead them into it. And then we're going to let it sit again for about an hour, and then it will be much softer and easier to work with. And we'll do another knead again with that. And then we let it rise to about an hour before we're ready to bake it up. And then we'll shape it into our balls.
Two different questions, but related. Does your oven have a proof setting? And then someone else asked, what is proofing?
Yes, so my oven does have a proof setting, which is when I shape it up to do that final rise before we bake it, I'll put it in there. And proofing keeps your oven at a nice warm temperature. Mine at least does at 95 degrees. But the concept of proofing is literally just allowing your dough to sit for a period of time so it can leaven, which means the natural gases puff it up. So you either have the yeast doing it or you have the sourdough starter doing it for it. Quick breads don't need a proofing time because they use baking soda and baking powder as their form of leavening. Here we go. So we've got this. Give it a nice. And now I'm just going to set this in our bowl here, and it's going to sit, and that the flour will hydrate over time, and then we'll do our kneading, and then we'll let it sit some more. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to decide whether we want to hop on the chicken first or let's start our sourdough for tomorrow. That way I can be done with kind of mixing up the dough, and then we'll do our chicken for tonight, and then we'll make our sandwiches. Okay. So I'm going to prep up 2 good-sized loaves of sourdough bread for tomorrow and the next day because they can proof in the fridge for 2 to 3 days. And I always like to make a double batch at it. Make sure I'm on grams. Since we're going to do a double thing, we're going to use 300 grams of active starter. So I'm going to use some from this guy and some from this, which is also proofing. So all of my starters are going to need new covers. Okay, so we want 300 grams. So I'm going to use a little bit from this one and a little bit from there. That way these will be ready to feed up and make some more. Okay, get this guy over here. And, You can just see how, you know what, today is a much warmer day in my house, and I can tell because the starter is really puffed up today. Put that in the sink to wash. But you can see it's all the way up to the top, so I'm just going to poke it down a little bit. And when you poke it, you're just popping those little gas bubbles in there, and you can see it just drops down. So we're going to add a little bit more in here to make 300 grams of our active starter, which means, here we go, you've fed it in the last 4 to 8 hours. I fed mine around like 9 o'clock today, so it's a good amount. I'm going to turn that off, and then we're going to add in our warm water. For my regular single loaf, I add 565 grams of warm water, so I need to add 1,130 grams of warm water. And this is why you need a scale, because a scale is going to give you the most accurate measurements for it, because you can use the standard like the US customary with baking, but your cup of flour could be off by up to 50 grams.
Well, what ratio do you feed your starter?
I typically feed my starter like 1 to 1 to 1. So like 1 cup of starter to 1 cup of flour to 1 cup of water. But let's see, 1. There we go. Let me just get right there. But a lot of times I also just do it by how it looks. I look at the kind of the thickness of how I want it to be, and that's how kind of like I will add a little more or less water to it. Because I don't whip out my scale when I'm doing it. I just use, again, the cups. So I always add my flour in first. I start to mix, and then I slowly add in my water. And I start by adding in about 2/3 of it, and then I add it till I get to the right consistency, because I find if it's too thin, it doesn't puff up as nice, and if it's too thick, it doesn't work as well. So we're going to mix these guys together, and then I'm going to add in 2 tablespoons of salt. Again, this is going to make 2 of my big loaves. So 1, 2. Give this a good stir. And then we're going to add in 1,500 grams of flour. I have a little bit of bread flour, but this isn't going to be enough to get me there. So I'm going to use bread flour and all-purpose flour. Bread flour is going to give you a really nice, chewier texture. I find all-purpose flour gives you a slightly fluffier loaf of bread. So really, either one works. I've done it all bread flour, all-purpose. They all work kind of really well with it. So we're going to start with my bread flour, and I need 1,500 grams, which is going to be a good amount, but it's more than what I have in this bag. So this is about 1,150 grams. So then we'll just finish it off with a little bit of, where did my flour go? There it is. It's right in front of me, guys. In here. We'll finish it off with a little bit more, and then we'll mix it together. And that way we'll be able to do at least one stretch and fold on screen so you guys can see what that looks like if you're new to the sourdough making process. Now, I do have recipe cards and videos for everybody on how you can make your own starter from scratch, as well as how you can make your own sourdough bread from scratch. Now, this isn't a process where you can wake up in the morning and say, hey, I want to make sourdough bread today. You're going to need an active starter, and that takes about a week to create on your own using flour and water to ferment. Okay, I've got my 1,500 grams of flour, and we're going to mix it into my base right here, which is my diluted starter. There we go. And this is my basic traditional recipe, and it is so good. Okay, I'm going to use my dough whisk here, and we're going to whip it up. And this is going to be a very wet and sticky dough. It's a high hydration one, which means you can't do like you would with a yeast dough or a, like even our sourdough roll things. You can't knead it. You do something slightly different, which is called stretch and folds. So once this is mixed up, we'll let it sit for, a few minutes till the end of the stream, and then I'm going to show you what to stretch and fold, which is essentially using wet hands to pull your dough up and over. Here we go. Beautiful. So just mix this guy up. Perfect. And I'm just going to mix it until all that flour is incorporated, and then we'll let it sit. But it is a very soft and fluffy dough. And for sourdough bread, it's delicious. The only ingredients in a traditional loaf is literally flour, water, and salt, because your starter is made with fermented flour and water. Here we go. Okay. We'll let this sit here. And then we can do our stretch and folds. I'll actually pull this out because we're done with that part of it. And let me check our timing on there. Okay, because I don't want to necessarily dive right into my chicken. I'm going to have to go pull those out. So we're going to pull that out in just a minute or so, I'm going to make our glaze for our scones. We're going to do a brown sugar and glaze, which means I need a little bit of butter here. Don't need a whole lot. We're going to do about 2 tablespoons of butter for this glaze, and we're going to melt it. We'll add in our brown sugar. So let me get this right here, and we'll turn it on. And then we just add a little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of cream, and a little bit of powdered sugar. It makes the best glaze. Now, you have to be careful when you're making the brown sugar glaze that you don't leave your brown sugar and butter melting for too long on the stove, or you're going to turn it to caramel, which, while caramel is delicious, it will not turn into a good glaze. I always do about equal parts brown sugar to butter. So since I used about 2 tablespoons of brown sugar or of butter, I'm going to use about 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, or just roughly a clump about the exact same size as the butter. Let me grab a little bit of a spoon here. So we'll grab a whisk, and we're going to whisk these together until that butter is just melted. And this should melt pretty fast because this is room temperature butter. But again, don't leave it in here unattended, or you're going to turn your brown sugar and your butter into a lovely caramel. But you need that butter to be melted up. And doing this process allows the brown sugar to start to dissolve a little bit. We will add in some cream, which will allow it to also dissolve some more to get rid of the grit, so we have a lovely smooth texture to our glaze. So here, it's all just about melted. So I'm going to turn off my thing, and we'll just let it sit with that residual heat. And then we're going to add in about 2 tablespoons of cream. So think 2 tablespoons of butter, 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, 2 tablespoons of cream, and then about a half a teaspoon of cinnamon. You can go more if you want a bit more. You could go up to a teaspoon. You don't need a whole lot because that cinnamon's really going to pop in there. And we're going to mix this, and then this is going to be kind of our base that we'll add our powdered sugar into to make our glaze. Here we go. But it's going to have a nice rich color. We're going to let that sit and kind of cool for a second. While we do, let's go grab our scones, our pumpkin scones, out of the oven. Here we go. I'll grab this. Look at these beautiful scones. See, I told you you've got to spread them apart because they really do pop up. You can see these epic layers there. That's from the press and the folds, which makes them light and fluffy, but yet still have that nice crunch on the outside of them. They're just delicious. Now we're going to want to glaze these while they're still hot, but not while they're just out of the oven. They need to sit down. But just look at those beautiful epic layers in there. That again is from the press and fold motion of when we're pushing that batter together. You don't want to ever just like mush it together or knead it, because that will give you a really dense scone versus the fluffy layers. Okay, let's add in our powdered sugar here. And then we'll let it kind of sit and we'll glaze it in a little bit once it's there. Okay. We're going to start with about a half a cup of powdered sugar in here, and we're going to whisk it together. Essentially, we want a glaze that is about the consistency of glue. That way it will drizzle over, oops, as I go a little crazy, it will drizzle over our scones, but we don't want it too runny that it runs right off. And you don't want it too thick that it's a frosting either. Here we go. I'll do a little bit more powdered sugar in here. We'll do about 2 more tablespoons. I think that should get us. Now, if you accidentally add in too much powdered sugar, you can always add in a little bit more cream. Just go very careful in the ratios, because a little bit of liquid will really cause it to get thin. That should be just about perfect. Okay. We've got those mixed up here. We're going to let that sit for just a second, and then once our scones have cooled down in a minute or two, we will kind of get them kind of coated over it. Okay, while we're waiting, we're going to prep up our chicken for dinner tonight. Now this is, I'm going to wash my hands since it got a little bit of powdered sugar on it. This is a really easy way to make a delicious chicken that doesn't take a lot of time. It's like 5 minutes of prep, and then you pop it in the oven when you're ready for it. And it's just so delicious. So we're going to start with 1 really big onion, or you can use 2 smaller ones, but this is such a massive yellow onion. It's going to be perfect for this. Okay. So we're going to start by, I'm going to slice off a couple circle edge, and then we'll kind of quarter it to stuff inside our chicken here. But what we're going to do with this first part is, these are my little onion rings. I'm going to layer them around the base of my Dutch oven here. And that way I'm not going to have my chicken resting directly on my like my bottom of my pan, which could cause it to kind of cook up a little bit, but yet it's going to sit on top of these onions, which is going to add a nice, like, very fragrant flavor to it, but also prevents it from getting both soggy or burnt. And then these are going to be used to stuff the inside of our chicken to give it a nice kind of fragrant flavor. Let me grab a bowl real quick, because we're going to make our herby base to it. And then we will push these herbs up underneath the skin. We'll stuff it, and then we'll pop it in there. So we're going to start with a good amount of olive oil. I'm going to say you're going to need like a 1/3 cup of olive oil to a 1/2 cup. I mean, I don't think you'll actually need a 1/2 cup, but we just start with a good base, because we're going to be rubbing this all over, and we're going to be creating a lovely paste. We're going to add in, we've got juice from a lemon. So I'm going to we'll squeeze it. And we're going to squeeze it in here, but don't get rid of your lemon peels, because you're going to actually stuff them inside the chicken, which is going to give it a really fragrant flavor. So we want the juice from these fresh lemons, but again, keep those. Let me rinse off this lemon juice real quick. And then let's add in our spices. We've got some onion powder here. I'm going to do about a tablespoon. We've got some dried oregano. We're going to use about around a tablespoon of dried oregano. We want lots of herbs, because it's going to add great flavor, and it's going to sit in here. I have some dried rosemary. I'm going to do about 1.5 teaspoons of dried rosemary. It's got a pretty strong flavor to it. And then I have some herbes de Provence, which is just like a lovely French blend. And we're going to use about, a 1/2 tablespoon of that. And then we're going to do about 1 teaspoon of ground black pepper. Here we go. And we're going to add in about a tablespoon, 2 teaspoons of garlic salt. Good shaky, shaky. And then let me grab a spoon, and we're going to add in a heaping spoonful of our garlic. Now, you could mince up some fresh garlic if you wanted to, but I also find the garlic works wonderful for this. And then we're going to mix this together, and this is going to create a very oily but herby kind of paste, which we're going to rub all over our chicken and inside our chicken. Okay, so let me move this to the side, and we're going to work on here. Okay, we want our breast side to be up when we're doing it. So, but before we put our base side down, we're going to reach in here, and we're going to rub these herbs on the bottom of our chicken here. So you want to make sure you get some on that base side. We'll put it in there. Now, take a good handful, and we're going to put it inside the base of our chicken, inside that belly here, and really fill it up. We're going to be using all of this herb base, so you don't need to worry about like your hands going in and out because it's all going to be used there. We're going to take one of our lemons, our halves, and we're going to shove it in there, and then we're going to take these onions. We're going to shove those inside the cavity of our chicken. This is going to give it a very lovely, fragrant onion and lemon flavor to it with all of these fresh dried herbs as well, or these dried herbs in there. Very important to stuff it up, stuff it really well. It's going to add so much flavor. Let's put our other half of our lemon in there. It also keeps that cavity nice and moist and tender, which allows that chicken to stay nice and moist and tender as well. Okay, now this is the part which can be a little bit tricky if you've never done it before. You're going to take your fingers and you're going to gently separate the skin from the chicken. And this is so we can put, and you might have to pull a little bit to kind of separate it up, but this is so we can spoon this herb mixture underneath this skin layer, which is going to allow it to really get into the chicken so you have a wonderful and flavorful meat. So you see how we have separated the skin from the chicken? Now you're going to just take our space and you're going to rub it in here. Now we will rub stuff on top of the skin, but this is crucial for allowing it to really get into the meat and get that flavor in there. Because nobody wants a bland chicken.
You have a request. Can you go over to the seasoning?
Yes. So we started off with about a 1/3 cup of olive oil, and then we added in about a tablespoon of onion powder, a tablespoon of minced garlic, a tablespoon of dried oregano, and then we did 1.5 teaspoons of herbes de Provence, 1.5 teaspoons of dried rosemary, and then a teaspoon of black pepper, and about 2 teaspoons of garlic salt. So we've got just all of this lovely herb base here. Now we'll put this over. Beautiful. I'm going to wash my hands because it's quite messy now. Here we go. Get a good scrub down. And then our last little part of this is we're going to pour in, I've got some chicken bouillon and water mixed together. And you're just going to pour it in around the sides of it to have a little bit of a kind of a bath in there so that when we roast up the chicken, and I'm not even sure I'm going to use all of it, I just want a thin layer. But when it's time to bake up our chicken, we will bake this at 425 with the lid on for about 45 minutes. And then we will take the lid off, and then we will bake it with the lid off for about 45 minutes to get you that nice crispy skin that isn't burnt. But that steam in there is going to allow, that broth is going to allow that chicken to stay very, very moist and delicious. Okay, let's pop this over here. We're going to drizzle up our scones. We're going to whip up our sandwich because we are almost done here for this. Okay. So last night we made this delicious focaccia for dinner. And I was like, you know what? Let's whip up a quick roast beef sandwich with it. So we have our Italian seasoned focaccia. This is with our this was a half sourdough starter with half yeast in it. But it was so soft and fluffy. You can even see how soft and fluffy it is, but it had a delicious crusty skin on it. So we are going to start by cutting this guy right down the middle in half. This makes, I want to say, leftover focaccia makes the best sandwiches because it has so much flavor to it, but it also has a delicious chewy crust to it. It's just lovely. Here we go. So let me grab my butter over here. And we'll just let it toast up just a smidge while we drizzle our scones, and then we will build out our sandwich. And then I can show you guys our last stretch and fold, and we'll be done. So like just a few minutes. And we've already completed half of our work for our dinner tonight, which is going to be wonderful. This is a way you can have a really great dinner on a weeknight without having to do a whole bunch of work at one time. You know, you've got the protein done, so it's just sides later. And of course, our rolls. I'm going to pop this on my skillet over here just so we can kind of warm and toast these up. And then we'll work on getting our thing made. Okay. So here are our pumpkin scones. And I've got my delicious brown sugar glaze here. And we're going to drizzle this over our scones. Now, I find using a whisk does a great job of getting a really delicious drizzle over it. There we go. Now, you want to do it while your scones are still warm, not piping hot, because if they're too hot, it will completely run off. But you want them warm so that they run over the sides instead of stay like a lump on the top, and really kind of coat it up.
Can you go over the glaze?
Yes. So we melted 2 tablespoons of butter with 2 tablespoons of brown sugar. Then we added in 2 tablespoons of cream, a half a teaspoon of cinnamon, and about 3/4 of a cup of powdered sugar. And that just gave us this delicious brown sugar glaze that was going to add an extra pinch of like sweetness to scones that aren't an overly sweet treat, but are delicious. Okay, so here is our sourdough bread that we prepped up. I told you this is a high hydration dough, which means it's going to be sticky, but don't let that scare you. The way you get around that is you make your hands nice and wet. Wet hands are essentially nonstick hands. And then we're going to do our stretch and folds, which means you're going to pull it up and fold it over. Pull it up and fold it over. Pull it up, fold it over. This is what you do in place of kneading with a sourdough bread. And you do this every 30 minutes for 2 hours. And all you have to do is 5 or 6 little stretches, and then you've got it good for the next one. It's a really important step that helps develop the gluten in your bread, as well as the lovely crumb on it for it. So really important. Okay, let's see how this butter is melting up. Beautiful. We are just about there. So we'll let that toast up just a little bit longer. Let's get our cheese and our sandwiches made, and then we can serve up. So I find roast beef and cheddar are just delicious. So I've got a big block of cheddar cheese, and we're going to just get my cheese peeler, and we will pull off some of our cheese, and we'll put it on there. That's why I want to toast up my bread, because I don't want to melt with the roast beef and cheddar, because with the focaccia, it's not going to toast up quite as nice. But Warming it up will allow this cheese to get a little bit nice and warm. Let's get this. Plenty good slices here. There we go. I think this should be nice and ready. We'll bring it over here for it. Okay. And there we go. We've got a nice kind of hot and toasty, a little bit of melted butter on there. And we're going to put our base layer of our cheddar cheese on here. There we go. So each one has a nice good layer. And then we're just doing a really basic roast beef sandwich. So I've got just some good old Hillshire Farm roast beef, but you could use really any one that you like. And you want to open it up and you'll get a good spread amount. I feel like this will make 2 really big sandwiches, or if you were to serve it with soup, this would easily make 4 perfect size sandwiches. Let's get all of this up. We're going to add it on, get our roast beef going. Beautiful. Perfect. So we've got our sandwich here. Now, before we put on our next layer of our cheese, we're going to add on some red onions. Red onions are perfect for sandwiches, salads, eating raw. And like I always say, you don't want to cook with red onions because they lose their texture and their flavor. But with a roast beef and cheddar, the red onions will be wonderful. Here we go. Nice kind of thin layer to give you that nice little crunch. And then let's finish up with our cheese. I always have to switch my angles and go to a different angle when I'm peeling. There we go. Because if you keep peeling the same one, I don't know if you guys ever have this issue, it like starts to break after a little while. Beautiful. Got our next one done. And now for the one for me, I like to make mine a little bit more bougie. I'm going to add in a little bit of sun-dried pesto because I feel like the roast beef and the cheddar will actually complement the sun-dried pesto beautifully. So I'm going to get this guy open. And I was super excited because my favorite marinara brand, Rayo's, apparently makes a sun-dried pesto. So I'll be interested. I've never tried their brand of it. But we're going to just take a small amount and then we're going to spread it on right here. You don't need to go super thick because sun-dried tomato has a lot of flavor. And then we've got our 2 jumbo roast beef and cheddar sandwiches, and we are ready to serve up our dinner or our lunch. And we've got so much of our dinner prep tonight, so we're like ahead of the game here. Okay, for lunch today, let's see which this one, we'll do mine. We've got our delicious roast beef and cheddar and sun-dried tomato on our homemade focaccia that we seasoned with Italian spices and garlic salt. We toasted it up and we'll have that ready for our lunch, which will just be a nice, light, and delicious. But the star really is we have our gorgeous pumpkin scones with our brown sugar glaze. You can see all of the layers in our pumpkin scone. This is created from our press and folds. We used a 1/2 cup of pumpkin puree in here, and we are going and we used our sourdough discard in there as well. So just a lovely, delicious lunch and simple today, but we also did a lot of prep. We prepped up our chicken for later tonight. So you'll have to come and join us back later when we roast this up, as well as our rolls. and prepped our sourdough. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us here today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I try to do live cooking shows every single day, kind of show you what we're making for our family and hopefully teach you guys something along the way. Again, we do upload all of our videos to the link on our page. So if you ever want to recreate any of these recipes at home, you can just go to our page, search for what we made. So we've got our pumpkin scones and our dinner prep, and you can always watch and cook along with me again. We also have a link to our Amazon storefront. This has all of our different cooking gear and gadgets. I've got my knives, my cutting boards, my Dutch ovens, my head skillet, all the different gadgets I use in the kitchen I have in there for you guys to check out. But again, thank you so much for joining us here. Don't forget to like and subscribe.